It is my pleasure to have Javier Leiva on our show today. It is so important for you to be going and talking about all of these subjects on the podcast, on this podcast, on other people's podcasts, I'm sure too, and having guests on who can talk about a wide variety of different sorts of things. I know we were just talking briefly about how this conversation can go in many different directions, which is kind of exciting to see where it goes. But I would love you to take a moment to introduce yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Javier Leiva. Like you said, I'm the host of the Pretend podcast. I have other podcasts too, but Pretend is my main podcast. And the shortcut, the elevator pitches that I tell people I interview con artists, but it's a little bit more than that, right? It's about deception, about people pretending to be someone else. I love that topic because we could really go and stretch that concept to many different places, and tell some really wild stories.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Wild stories. Yep.
Yeah.
And over my time doing this work for 30 some odd years, I've met a few cult leaders, and you've met some. And you, when you meet people, and also the kind of more sociopathic partners of people who, even in couples counseling, I can sort of see that someone is a malignant narcissist with their spouse, and I want to be able to tell them right away that I'm like my spidey senses are tingling, and it's a really interesting thing. It's really, I think, off-putting and disconcerting, and you can feel it when you're with someone who just doesn't care about the human experience in the same way that other people might. And so I'd love to have you talk about those kinds of experiences, and also con artists, and sort of what makes them tick and why they do what they do or feel entitled to do what they do. Years and years ago, I was called to a ballroom in the Lowe's Hotel in Santa Monica. And it was a film crew that asked me to come. They were doing like a story where they were trying to get live coverage of this meeting run by this leader, a cult leader named Rael, and he ran and still runs the Raelians. And they believe it's another sort of mothership, that they are, extraterrestrial beings, blah, blah. And I remember he walked up to me, Rael walked up to me, kind of almost looked like he was floating. He had had a long gown that went past his feet, so it really looked like his feet weren't touching the ground. And he walked up to me and very gently just looked in my eyes and said, "You are actually about the same height as Jesus." And I thought, wow, that's an intro. So that's the first time I've ever had a conversation that started that way, I have to say. But
that's a good line. I might have to use that.
Right? But what he wanted you to know, of course, is he's met him, right?
Right.
So that's how he knows, right? Duh.
Yeah. Such a short comment, but it said so much, right?
Right? It said so much. And it also showed that he had no social skills, because you say hello, how are you, or whatever, or what are you doing here? Why do you want to interview me? But just that I'm going to take charge of this moment and show you that I'm superior to you, that I have met these special people, and I'm going to bait you to ask me, oh, have you met him? So I didn't. But it was fascinating just to see the power play from the start, and said with a whispery voice, but it was meant to be a powerful moment. I don't know if he was so enamored with me after because I didn't take the bait. But I'm sure that, you've had some interesting conversations. So what brought you to this area of study?
Well, I mean, particularly cults, it's a funny story, but I do have a journalism background. I worked in TV news for many years. I did documentaries for PBS. So I'm a storyteller. It's not that I have some sort of fascination with cults, or even true crime for that matter. I don't even like true crime. But I kind of got sucked into this world from day one. And I'll tell you, but I actually want to respond to something you said earlier that I don't want that thought to get away from me.
Sure, go
because
ahead.
you mentioned two types of cult leaders. you mentioned, the man who just approached you and said that, you're the same height as Jesus. He's very extravagant, and you could kind of, pick up on what he's putting out, right? But
Mhm.
then you also mentioned the relationship cult and the narcissists. That I just got off a call with a listener who basically just was venting about her marriage and her relationship with a narcissist. And so while those two narcissists are very wildly different, they're both using that same kind of control that you described. They're sizing you down. They're trying to make themselves, more powerful, more authoritative than you. And even though
Mhm.
they seem wildly different at first blush,
Mhm.
it's amazing how similar they are.
Yeah.
But going back to how I got into this,
Mhm.
I got the idea after I left news for a couple of years. I had that itch that I still wanted to tell
Mhm.
stories. I still wanted to do some journalism. So I said, "Oh, I'll start a podcast." But I didn't know what the
Mhm.
podcast was about. I came up with the
Right.
concept of pretend, but I didn't know what it was about. And one day I was driving to go to the grocery store. And I mean, the grocery store is only like a minute from the house. So it wasn't even that long of a trip. But
Mhm.
I had the news on. It was the local news, and they were talking about this church in Western North Carolina that's accused of beating their members, and they had this screaming prayer. I mean, in that 1 minute drive, it piqued my interest, and I was like, "What?" And so this is where I live in North Carolina. So I immediately got home and just started researching. I didn't even catch the name of the cult, but I figured it out immediately who it was, and then I found a former member who lived near me, and I
Wow.
reached out to him, and
Mhm.
we set up a meeting in a very neutral location, and the rest is history. That was my first episode of Pretend, and it's been almost 8 years later, and still one of the most impactful series that I've ever done because I had so much access inside this church that it was crazy.
Wow, it is incredible how there are certain moments, that take our lives in different directions, really powerful directions.
Mhm.
It's like sometimes when people ask me when they have a loved one who's involved in a relationship with a controlling partner or involved in a cultic group, what will the catalyst be? What will help them open their eyes? What will be kind of that thing that's a bridge too far that will make them say, okay, this is not okay? And it's different for everyone. And I wish
Yeah.
there were a predictor, but it has to do with not only something happening, but you being open to it at the time because it struck you that day, maybe in a way that it
Mhm.
might not have even on another day. But thank goodness it did, because you've been able to do so much and educate people about so much since that moment. And yes, this group is known for its abuses and its harassment and intimidation of people within it and traumatizing people, which is
Yeah.
not dissimilar from a lot of the other groups that come to my attention that are supposed to be safe spiritual places. And so when you met with this person who had left, what did you find out?
Well, I was way in over my head because this person had recorded incidents with the the head of the church, which is her name is Jane Whaley, the leader of the church.
Mm,
Little tiny little old lady
mhm.
with blonde, almost like helmet type hair, perfect, immaculate, like
Right.
and it's the last person that you would imagine to be this nefarious like cult leader,
Mhm.
right? But he recorded some of his interactions with her, secret interactions with
Mhm.
her, and there's a recording of her saying, "Throw him to the ground and get his devils out," and she's shouting this, and it's almost like a command, like throw him and beat him down. But later, the way the church interprets that, they're like, no, 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 this is just the way this branch of Christianity talks. We throw people down. It's a figurative thing, and get the devils out is how we pray for, so they justify it. But
Mhm.
there were accusations of babies and little kids being strapped down and the members yelling at them because you see this cult or this church, Word of Faith Fellowship, they have a screaming prayer. And it's not just speaking in tongues. I think that's not speaking in tongues is like, this is like a piercing, ah, they're yelling at the top of their lungs at little kids, and they're accused of strapping them down because otherwise they would get away, and that's their signature prayer, which is called blasting.
Yeah.
And that's what made them unique. But there were some cases of a homosexual man who was maybe a late teen or something like that, and he said that the members just crowded him after church and just beat the gay devils out of him. And they had a building that they called the lower building. It was a building that was outside the property, outside the main building, that they would keep the men who they felt like had impure thoughts, or some men reportedly had been in that lower building for over a year now. And it was just such an interesting dynamic where you have this female-led church, which some people call a cult, that had every hallmarks of a cult, and these male prisoners almost, being held inside. And so it was a really compelling story. And so when I met him that day at the park, and he let me listen to that, it was really urgent. It felt urgent to get that story out.
Yeah. Oh, and I'm so glad that you were helping to facilitate that. There are a lot of other stories of people who are held against their will, who are in some form of solitary confinement, who are in a basement, who are held in Scientology. There are a lot of stories there with being sent to the brig, the whatever, under the ship, one of their naval ships, because of L. Ron Hubbard being the commodore of his navy. It all, like, as I say things out loud, I realize, I do realize how they sound. Okay.
Yeah. But when you're in it, it makes sense.
Right. And then there's this thing also in Scientology, they call it the hole, where it's also this space that, people can't get out of. It is terrifying. And also to think about them screaming at a baby and what that does. And can you ever get past that? That is a trauma that goes into your nervous system from early on. And when you also are raised in an environment where the adults who are supposed to protect you, which is what you believe when you're a baby especially, are participating in harming you, and that you have no protections. I'm sure that does a number on you for the rest of your life, to varying degrees, depending upon how much help you can get with that. There's so many of these groups they know nothing about child development. They know nothing about psychology. A lot of the people, including the leader of this group with the helmet hair, as you described, didn't even have a background in ministry. I mean, she just sort of, I think then people kind of make it up as they go along. And then you have your own
maybe
brand.
No interest at all in right? Like, that's not the point. The point was control and power.
Yeah.
And, going back to the lower building, these men, primarily men that were in that building, there were no locks on the door. The windows could open, right? And that's something, like, when you ask them, well, why didn't you just leave? And they didn't. And what's tricky about this place is that, you see, I grew up Catholic, and I'm fairly new, I guess not new to the South anymore. I've lived here for like 20 years, but a lot of churches are evangelical churches. A lot of churches believe in the prosperity gospel. So it gets a little murky, right? Like, what is a very conservative church versus what is a cult? And I wanted to be sensitive to that, because some people that maybe grew up in that environment were like, well, my church was like that. But did your church beat you? Did the screaming prayer, like the isolation, making sure that you're not communicating with your friends and family in the outside world, the constant text threads trying to keep you working at night, keeping you busy, smothering your time. That's where you really have to tease these things out, because people go in thinking they're joining a church, and even the one teenager that I told you that got beat because that he says he got beat because he was gay.
Yeah.
He went to the church knowing what we know that about all the accusations. He was just going as a joke, oh, let's laugh at these people. And guess what? He ended up getting suckered in. Isn't that something? I mean, he went in knowing, and then somehow they flipped the script.
Two things I wanted to say in response to what you were just saying, that a lot of people get asked, and I have videos about this with this subject. The title is "Why Did I Stay?" And they get asked that a lot. And sometimes I don't know if it's the right question. It's because then you're putting the onus on the person who stayed to have to justify why they did what they did, as opposed to really kind of asking the bigger question, which is, how do you put someone in a situation where they feel they can't leave, even though they can?
And it's going back to the lines that you described earlier. It's like when you have that self-awareness that maybe you're in a situation that you can't control. Or it could be a relationship, it could be a church, it could be whatever. And then you say, as long as they don't do this and they don't cross this line, but then they cross it, and then you're like, well, as long as they don't do that, and then you keep redrawing the line. I think that could be a good self-guard if we could respect ourselves. Like this lady that I was talking to that was in pretty abusive relationship. Her husband, who was just an acquaintance at the time, had cancer. He really did have cancer. And she posted on Facebook, oh, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I could do? Which is like, she wasn't really going to do anything. It's just something people say,
right. Yeah.
And he said, I would love a strawberry banana smoothie. And she didn't expect that. And she's like, well, now I got to. I mean, I did say anything you could do. So she went to the hospital. This guy's an acquaintance. Took him a banana smoothie. Then he contacted her again. The next time he met her, he told her that he loved her. They didn't even know each other. But right away, the power dynamic shifted, right? So like if you're in a relationship or if you're in a organization that is violating some of your norms, you just have to have these safeguards in place. Like, what is acceptable to me? What am I going to allow?
What am I going to allow? Right, exactly. And what have I also been programmed to not respond to, or to feel that it would be selfish of me to do the following, or it would be wrong of me, or I'd be leaving God if I didn't stay,
Or even when you met that guy in Santa Monica and he told you that you're the same height as Jesus, you didn't take the bait. And just that's something that simple. When somebody sets you up and like fight the temptation to take the bait, give yourself permission to step back, right? Because that's the thing. If you're in a high control situation, stepping back is the best option, right? Because then you got to assess the situation. But it's really hard. I mean, we're talking like hindsight 2020, right? When you're in it, you're in it. And it's really and before we get too far along, I do want to point out one thing. I covered the Word of Faith Fellowship in 2018. I have, since my coverage and the exposure that we brought, I have not heard of any more physical abuse allegations. They're still operating, but I feel like that's a huge success. Now, is it happening behind closed doors? Possibly. I don't know. But I have so many contacts within the church, both in and out. I feel like I would have heard something by now. There's still the control in terms of who you could talk to, who you can, But in terms of the most serious allegations, I feel like I haven't seen it. So I just wanted to point that out.
Wow. I hope that is the case, and that would be very powerful. And it says a lot about the need to speak out and to take that chance, and to know that you're going to be potentially saving a lot of people from harm, which is very powerful. I'm sure it feels very good to know.
And I continually keep up with them too. So Butch, I know you're listening. He's one of their members and he reaches out to me all the time. He's very friendly. We actually have very good discussions over text, and he checks in on me every now and then. And so I know they're following me just as much as I'm following them.
I love that shout out. Yeah. Right. Just being real. So, you also mentioned about someone going kind of as a joke. There are people who will say, I really want to check out a group, or I have a loved one in it, and so I'm going to go undercover. Because I need to see how they're doing. I've lost contact with them, and I'll caution people because that happens, that they think that they're able to withstand the pressure, but then you see they get involved in this very well-oiled machine of manipulation. And if one thing doesn't work, then something else is tried, and they just need to grab onto you.
Rachel, that happened to me when I was invited, not to get ahead of ourselves, but eventually I did so much coverage about this church that Jane Whaley, the leader, emailed me and invited me to spend a day with her. And I went in full well knowing everything I know, right? And I came back home and my wife asked me, how did it go? And I said, they're not so bad. I mean, they love bombed me to the point where I was even questioning everything I was doing, because they're lovely people. They really are. People that I've met while they were inside and then outside, they're just good people, and that's what's hard as a journalist, because you tend to caricature of these people. You create these caricatures, and then you meet them in real life, and then you realize, they're real people. And and I had that love bombing. Took a while for it to fade for me, even after all the coverage that I did.
Can we? I know you're saying we were getting ahead of ourselves. Can we jump into that? Because I would love to hear about that day. So what was your impression? Because now you can even set up the scene and the visuals and what it was like when you arrived and all of it. Go for it.
That was a day I'll never forget. But what was more striking was that I'm doing this very critical reporting on this church, and I never ever in a million years thought that I would pierce through and actually get them to talk with me, because they had never spoken to a journalist, or at least never invited a journalist to their church. And so I just kind of assumed that was, not going to happen. But I had to do my due diligence, and I emailed Jane Whaley, just asking, hey, I would love to interview you. And to my surprise, I remember this day clear as day. My kids were little. We were camping outside. So I had the tent set up in the outside. And I wake up and I roll over and I just check my phone. And I had an email from Jane Whaley. It was on a Saturday. And she goes, can you come tomorrow and spend the day with me? And I said, yeah. And so, came up with a quick plan, recruited a buddy of mine who I barely knew, but he's like, hey, if you ever need help with the podcast, let me know. And I called him and I said, hey, I need help with the podcast. And so we drove to the mountains of Western North Carolina, and the plan was drop me off at this church. If you don't hear from me by noon, you see, there's also can't just call the police, because some of the allegations are that because this is in a small town in Spindale, North Carolina, they're embedded with local law enforcement and the politicians. So it's like, call somebody if you don't hear from me. So the moment I was dropped off, I was greeted at the side of the church, near the offices, near Jane's office, by Jane's daughter, all these women with the helmet hair, because they're dressed like these very expensive type dresses, and they're just surrounding me and literally love bombing me, hugging me, and any pit of my stomach nervousness that I had, which I did, just immediately went away, because I felt so comfortable. And I met Jane's husband, Sam, and I walked in, and then that's when I think I'm trying to remember. Then I met Jane, and from that moment on, I was next to Jane that entire day. I sat down with her during the service, and the service went without a hitch. It actually seemed like any other church service I've ever been to. There was no blasting prayer. I did not hear during the service, but it was very, very loud. Jane, I think, writes all the music. And it's very, very, even though there was no screaming, there was very, very loud. And then after service, Jane and I sat down in her office, and I was able to ask her all the questions. No question was off limits. And she even performed a blasting prayer at me. So a blasting prayer, just to remind you, is this intensely loud scream. It gave me chills, It almost seemed, and I described this all, she didn't really do this, but it seemed like she unhinged her jaw and was just shooting me with all this energy. Wow. And that's something I'll never forget.
That's incredible. I also think about people who have different sensory sensitivities. And, when I ask people what kind of cultic group they were involved in, and they let me know, I also know that I can't then assume that their experience or the after effect of it is going to be the same as the next person's, because there's some people who might have sensory sensitivity, who might be on the spectrum, or just can't handle loud noises. And so for them, this would be hugely traumatizing. And for others, maybe not so much. But I wonder, even though you knew that it was in part staged.
Oh, that whole service was for me.
Yeah.
That was just, everybody knew. Even though nobody looked at me, I knew that was just a big performance for me.
Right. Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. Even the helmet hair makes me nervous. I just have to say. It feels so Stepfordy, I never got the memo.
Well, and not to get political, but you see, whenever you see in the New York Times or anywhere, like the women for Trump, do you ever see those pictures? It's always them. It's the Word of Faith Fellowship. It's Jane, her daughter, and her entire crew. They're always there. Yeah. It's crazy. But and then a little other sidebar that's not political, but I thought it would be a funny little tidbit. While after the service, people were just lined up to talk with me, right? Like they were just wanting to introduce themselves, and people from all over the world. I mean, from Switzerland. I met a Cuban guy just like me, and he invited me over for dinner. I mean, like very friendly people. And then one guy came up to me, and he was a former drummer for Paul McCartney. For Wings, yeah.
What?
But you see, he can no longer play the drums because, according to Jane, the drums are the devil's music, right?
Yeah.
So this drummer for Paul McCartney doesn't play the drums anymore. It's just so wild.
That's a crime. We'll add that to the list of crimes. Yeah. Okay. Wow. But that's interesting. That happens a lot. They're going back to it's not that all roads lead back to Scientology, but I know someone who's a colleague and a friend who, Jeff Levin, who was in this group, like in the 1960s, and he got involved in Scientology and had to stop. But they were on their way to making, like this #1 record and having a hit, and it all just collapsed. And then he was only allowed to help write music for the group. And now that he's out, he's able to sort of try to get his career back. But it's hard when the thing that you really love is taken from you. So I can only imagine what that was like for him. Okay, so you have this whole PR going, right? This whole thing for the day. But it seemed to do the trick, to a certain degree.
Right. Yeah. And I knew that. I mean, I could rationally, I knew that they're not going to just beat kids in front of me. They're not going to do that.
Right.
And in fact, they don't openly do that anyway. And that kid that went there just for a joke, he had the same experience probably that I have. Like when you're new, they're going to love bomb you. You're going to think it's great. In fact, A lot of people that they try to recruit are people who are down on their luck, right? People who are either in financial trouble, and all of a sudden you have all these people that look wealthy and they're showering you with love and they're helping you out. They're giving you a place to stay.
Mm-hmm.
They're like they're God sent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden you forget about the bad stuff. The bad stuff, according to the people I've spoken to, doesn't happen until much later, and it happens gradually, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it could all be explained away. Like
Yeah.
Jane Whaley, when I asked her point blank about some of the physical abuse that's being alleged, she said, "Well, look, this form of prayer that we do, some people just get so into it, so taken by it that it sometimes gets physical, but we tell people not to. It's like the screaming and then because you hold them down and kind of scream at them, and it could get physical. And she says people are just caught in the moment, and that's where the allegations are coming from.
Mm-hmm.
But it's much more than that, right? So
Yeah.
the physical abuse allegations are the things that stand out, but it's so much more. Like any classic control group,
Mm-hmm.
it's what it does to you mentally and
Mm-hmm.
how it wears you down.
Right.
That's where the trauma is at.
I think also about the use of language here on her part, that you're using the word abuse, at least that's what it is, and she's saying form of prayer. Or she's basically talking about people getting kind of enthusiastic about what it is that they're doing and what it is they're doing for this other person. And so, yeah, I can already see there is like a watering down
Hmm.
of what it really is. And that affects people also because they sometimes don't go for help because they don't know they were abused. And so it takes a while, that's why I think there shouldn't be a statute of limitations, because sometimes it takes a while for people where the language was different for them
Right.
to know that's what happened to them.
Yeah.
And wow. Okay. So there you spent the day. And it's interesting you pointed out intellectually. Yeah, intellectually, logically, we can look at that. But emotionally, there is there is something very powerful about what also happens simultaneously to you. And a lot of people, I think, have that simultaneously where they, when I talk to people who first got involved in a group, they will sometimes say, you know what, I did have wonderings. Something didn't seem right, but they were so lovely and they smiled and I was enveloped, or I was going through a period of time in my life where I was really needing community. So I ignored the red
Hmm.
flags. And I guess you saw firsthand how that's all too easy.
And I think it's easy to vilify some of the people on the inside that carry on out some of these things, because when we talk about cults, it's a hierarchy, right? So you have the
Mhm,
leader, it's on top, but then you have like this middle management type layer, right?
mhm.
Where they're the ones that are the enforcers, right?
Yeah, right.
And it's easy to vilify the enforcers, the people on the inside. But you have to
Mhm,
remember, and from my time covering this, I mean, it's been a long time, right? Almost 8 years. I've
mhm.
seen some of these middle manager type people go from villains to leaving the church and becoming just like the other survivors, right? And so you have to approach this with empathy, right? Because just because they're on one side one day,
Mhm.
that hopefully eventually, right? Eventually they'll be on the other side, and then it changes, right? So you have to approach it very delicately and with a lot of empathy, because it would be so easy just to say these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, right?
All too easy. And,
Right.
with, uh, the people I've talked to or who are in my support groups and other things where they became kind of the sub leaders, um,
Hmm.
they talk now about having a lot of moral injury, that they feel bad about
Yeah.
what they taught people to do or what they did to other people because
Hmm.
the leader had convinced them this is really what was right, or this is what people needed, or this is what the world needed. And it's hard
Yeah.
because it went against their conscience, actually.
Yeah. I mean, if a cult leader is doing it right, their hands aren't dirty at all, right? It's this middle manager level that they're the ones that are doing the dirty work, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine that comes with a lot of guilt.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you
Yeah.
get over that, you know?
Right. No, it's very hard. It's hard because well, the word, I mean, I know that that was potentially a hypothetical question, but I'll answer it a little bit, which is to say that there are, uh, there's a distinction here that I think is important, which has to do with intention.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you are involved and your intention is a good one or a pure one, and you really are of this belief that you're going to carry forward what you were taught because you've come to believe that it's what you needed.
Mhm.
And then you give it to other people. You're not thinking, it's not like you're wringing your hands over a cauldron and like, how can I,
Mhm.
hurt people?
Yeah.
How can I help them? And this is the
Right.
way I bring them closer to salvation or whatever the word
Mhm.
is that you're dealing with there, if it's a
Right.
religious group or not.
Yeah.
Um, the cult leaders very often have a very different intention. I mean, I know there are some who really are not well,
Right.
and they have their own psychosis, and I think then their intention is pure because they're not trying to manipulate, they're just very
Right.
charismatic in their way, and people follow them.
Mhm.
But by and large, I think the person at the top, their intention is to control and manipulate and use people for their own gain, but the next people in line usually have a much more pure intention.
Yeah. And it's so funny. I mean, if you want to pivot away from the cult for a second, because you made me think of just a con artist situation. Remember, that's what I
Mm.
cover the most.
Yeah,
And
that's I definitely wanna move into that.
well, I just think that the relationship is the same, right? So I did this one story a long time ago. It was the widow of a Wendy's CEO. Okay, this little,
Okay.
and she's an old lady now. I forget how old she was, but she's this widow. Suddenly, she has this fortune. Right, her
Okay.
husband
Yeah,
just
yeah,
passed away,
yeah.
and this Ohio State quarterback retired. Um, Archleister, I don't know if you know who he is, but anyways, he approaches her, he meets her, and she becomes a target, right? Because all of a sudden she's this woman with a lot of money. Is a gambler. His life is spiraling out of control, and she has all the funds, right? So he befriends her. I don't think there was a romantic relationship, but he drained her bank accounts dry. Could you imagine how much money this lady had and how he made her go broke? And now this is a little old lady who never would have ever thought that she would be wrapped up in something like this or consider herself a con artist. But because he drained her bank accounts, she now started conning some of her friends to loan her money. And
Whoa.
so that dynamic is very interesting, right? So you have this guy, he's a con artist, he's taking advantage of this woman for her
Mhm.
money. She runs out of money, and now she's in a position where she would have never naturally have done this, that she is scamming her friends, right?
Incredible.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that's very interesting when we think about that Venn diagram you were mentioning, I think, before the call. It's like you have cults and then you have con artists. And I think that the middle part is a lot more overlap than we even realize.
That is really fascinating. So right, so, moving on into this, because when we look at con artists, we do see a lot of people who we are then gonna recognize, people who scammed us. I mean, everyone is susceptible in small ways and big ways, people who find themselves sort of selling products and finding out it's multi-level marketing and whatever
Yeah.
else, and there's no way to make a buck.
Right.
Um, but I wonder then what you've learned about con artists and telling us some of those stories because it really is it's a fascinating facet of our human condition that there's some people who are really good at it.
Mhm.
And most of us, I think, are susceptible to it. So
Right.
it's something that's always going to be an issue, I think, for humans.
Yeah, and going back to the cult, a cult leader, if they're doing their job right,
Yeah,
they
right.
are the ultimate con artist because
Mhm.
they draw you in. They're like the light and you're the moth, you know what I mean? And you walk towards them because you think they're this amazing person, right?
Right.
And it's not till it's too late that you realize, oh, wow, okay, either, I lost everything, whatever. Con artists is the same thing, right? So like a great con artist will draw you in. They are always the first ones to pay for dinner. They're the first ones to give you stuff. And so right away your defenses are down, right? Because you're like, oh, well, this person is so generous. Why would they ever con me? But that's part of the con, right? It's not until later. And it's artificial empathy that they use, right? They just know how to use it. They understand that that's how we communicate, right?
Right.
And they're very good at mimicking our emotions, even though I find that they don't always experience that themselves. And I think that's where the narcissism comes in, right? Like the lack of empathy for humans. And another thing about con artists that's very interesting is that, and cult leaders, right? I would say that this works for both, is that they both start out with good intentions. Like very rarely. I mean, I've seen it. I covered some Ponzi schemes on my other podcast, Ponzi Playbook. Very rarely does a scam start out with the intention of scamming somebody. It's usually like, oh, this is a win-win for you, a win-win for me, right? But it's when the situation goes sour or like their luck starts running out and the money starts drying up, is that if it's either you or me, it's always going to be me. Okay. That's where the con starts, right? So I don't think that a lot of people that find themselves in a relationship that the power imbalance, right? I don't think that it starts off with bad intentions. I just think that when they get into survival mode, when their back is against a corner, it's always going to be them. And if you could win, that's cool too, but they will win,
Right. Right. Yeah. I was thinking of the show Survivor as you were talking, actually.
Just like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
I love that show, by the way.
You do.
Can't wait. The new season.
It's interesting too, because there have been studies about psychopathy and the percentages of psychopathic tendencies as you get higher and higher up the food chain, like CEOs and Fortune 500 companies. It's within the general population, it's 1% or less. Within the prison population, it's about 15%, although I think that might be exaggerated because I think people are pushed to behave certain ways, I think also for survival. So I do think that is inflated. But what they find with CEOs is it's about 12%, which is astronomically high in comparison to general population, because you have people who are very comfortable in their job and have moved forward because they have low empathy. They don't have time for caring. And they're antisocial. They bully employees. They are risk takers. They feel entitlement. They, all the things. They're egocentric. They manipulate.
But that's part of what makes them successful, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So they kind of
where do you draw the line?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Those are all could be good traits, depending on the context, right? But it's like, where do you draw the line at whose expense,
Right. And
because sometimes in business you have to be cold, right?
Possibly, right. I mean,
I was laid off recently. I was I'm sure a line in some sort of spreadsheet that the person who came up with that idea that probably had no empathy for me, or maybe they did. I don't know. But sometimes business is business, right? Or going back to your Survivor comment. I mean, a lot of people on that show, they're put in situations where the real world rules don't apply, and that it's a game. It's and some people just really have a hard time playing the game because they can't violate their own principles. And then some people, like Russell Hines or whatever his name was, they just love that. That's their game. They're like, this is a game where empathy is actually not a virtue, right?
No, it kind of gets in the way, and so I would be horrible at this. Horrible. I almost feel like after watching a show like that, I need to take a shower. Like I have to just sort of get that off.
Yeah, it's kind of gross. Yeah.
Right. So tell us more about the con artists and people you've come across and people you've studied, so we can kind of get into that mind and what you've
Oh,
noticed.
wow. Yeah, I think the one that comes to mind is probably one of my most recent series is my series is called Who's Afraid of LaDonna Humphrey?
Oh,
And it is such a wild story, and it's a really hard story to boil down to a point, but let me give it a shot.
okay.
So LaDonna Humphrey, she's a true crime writer, speaker, author. She's very big in the true crime world, and she's very famous for covering one case, which is the case of Melissa Witt in Arkansas. And it was one of her ex-colleagues reached out to me and told me the other side of LaDonna Humphrey that we don't realize. And in short, is that LaDonna Humphrey is accused of creating the content that she's reporting on. So one of her former colleagues, her co-host for her podcast, she was reportedly sending messages as this serial killer, like tormenting her co-host. And then they were producing podcasts about it. They even wrote a book about it. And that's just like one of the many things that she's accused of. But talk about control, right? So
Mhm.
LaDonna is always a good guy, and then she's terrorizing these people to create that urgency that sometimes you find in a cult, right? That heightened sense of like, what do I do?
Right,
And
right.
and taking control of that situation and exploiting those people. That it's just crazy. And what's really interesting about that series is that it's very unique because LaDonna, for some reason, doesn't like to text message. She likes to record voice memos. And so we have this rare insight into how she thinks and how she manipulates the people that are accusing her of these
Mhm.
things. So you get to hear it from her own voice, especially when she was exposed for being the serial killer was called Fetish Master. It was a screen name that she used.
Okay. Mhm.
And one day, while she was sending her co-host screenshots of her desktop, she didn't realize that she was still logged in under Fetish Master.
Oh.
And then we get all the voice memos of her trying to explain away how that could have happened. And it's very interesting as we talk about like these cults, right? I mean, right away, that should have been like, I'm out, but her
Mhm.
co-host hung in there and she believed her for a while. And these people, they seize control of you and they smother you, right? With
Right.
it, like, just like a cult leader does, they smother you so you can't think rationally, and they try to explain away all these things that don't make sense to you,
Mhm.
and it was really interesting. It's a first person view into this kind of dynamic, and you
Mhm.
get to hear it for yourself. So
That is
but,
really fascinating. I wonder also about having a voice, because then it makes me think, and I don't know this person at all, but it
right,
makes
right,
me think that she knows that she has a voice that she can use to
yeah.
persuade.
She's listening to, so hi LaDonna, how's it going?
Yeah.
Just kidding. Another shout
Okay.
out.
Another shout out.
No.
Hey. But
No, but yeah, I mean, yeah, you're
right,
right.
like she can come across a certain way in a way that she can't probably if she's just typing.
Right.
She might know that she can come across as sympathetic and other things.
And here's an interesting thing. So with LaDonna herself, because in the face of all these accusations and these things that came out, I mean, I forgot, I lost track of how many episodes we did on this because it was
Wow.
that big.
Wow.
After all these accusations that have come out against LaDonna still maintains this pristine persona that she's this true crime expert. She's still writing blogs and articles about this case. She's putting on in a month or two, I think she's putting on a true crime festival. She's carrying on like if none of this ever happened. So there's this public persona image
Mhm.
that she maintains,
Mhm.
which defies logic, right? Because the gig is up. We all know what's going on. And you would think that you would pack up your stuff and find
Right.
a new hobby, like true crime's not your thing. We've uncovered all this about you, about this decades long harassment campaign that you have done, not for one person, not just her co-host, but for dozens of people that have independently told me the same kind of harassment. And these people didn't know each other. Okay, so how could all these people have experienced the same thing? We were able to match text message numbers from one person to the other. Like the same number was harassing two different people during the same time. The only common denominator is LaDonna.
Right.
And despite all this, she marches on, and it doesn't make sense, which just tells you, if we're thinking about the psyche of a con artist or a cult leader, is that thick skin is not even the right term. It's some sort of like just they're just working on a whole different level that we don't even understand, because most people would just hang it up and do something else, but she carries on.
Right. I mean, who are most people, right? Most
I don't know,
people in
just
this
like us, like,
situation are
I don't know,
people.
like if I got caught doing something wrong, I would apologize, and then I would probably be so embarrassed I would never show my face again.
Well, right. I was going to say, most people would feel shame. Most
Right.
people would feel bad. Whether it is that you have an internal locus of control or an external locus of control. Internal being that you feel guilty. You realize what you did. That was wrong. External locus of control, you feel embarrassed or shamed. Either way, it's going to make an impact on you. But if you're impervious to that, then you just walk around feeling entitled and untouched, unfazed by all of this. But I think it might, and maybe, let me know what you think about this, because you've, dealt with this, I think, more directly. I think that con artists only have the con. This is all they have. They don't have other skills. Like, they couldn't get a day job. They couldn't.
Yeah, like this is what they know how to do.
Exist in the wild, right? They
This is what they're good at.
So this is what they know how to do. So they're just going to pick up and do it again.
Yeah.
And I think it also means detaching yourself from the emotions around you and what you're doing. I mean, what have you found that you think that are con artists just con artists and they can't do anything else, or they don't want to do anything else?
Well, and they're narcissists and egotistical people. Like, they're not going to just pack up and go, because they're proud. I find that a lot of, there's an inherent flaw with my podcast, right? Because the moment you interview one con artist, and everyone should know from there on, that point on, that this is what this podcast is about. So, like, who would want to come on my show, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? You would think it would be a one and done, and then that's it. But I keep talking with these people. Sometimes they approach me. A lot of times they approach me. Sometimes I approach them. But most of the time, and not all the time, but most of the time, they want to talk. I can only think of one con artist that told me to take a long walk off a short pier. But for the most part, they want to make their case.
Yeah.
And they want their story heard, either through pride, because of pride or whatnot, or maybe they still want to continue to manipulate us. But like you said, this is what they know, and they are not going to back down. They might do something else. It might change, right? So Ponzi schemers are great at this, right? Like, they start one investment scheme, and they'll get caught. They might serve some time. Then they get out and they start a different kind of scheme. But this is what they do. This is what they know. And so LaDonna cannot pack it up, because she has, her identity now is this, and and sometimes cult leaders and con artists thrive with negative attention. They get this mentality, like, look at all these people attacking me, or attacking us in the case of a cult. And it puts them in a position where they're the victims, and it's us against them type of thing. And sometimes that kind of dynamic works for them. They just evolve. They're very great. And this is what your business analogy, they're very good at adapting. Right.
Right. That's so interesting. So what have you seen? What have been some adaptations? Because, there are there are cult leaders, like people who started large group awareness trainings, and then they're brought up on charges. So they kind of change their persona, or they change the name of the group, and they just keep going with the same thing. But people don't know it's all connected. So what have been some of these transformations that you've seen?
I do believe in second chances, and I do believe in groups like I've featured groups like the White Collar Support Group of people who have been involved in either financial crimes or whatever, and they are out of prison. And as a felon, you don't have a lot of options, right? And so, like, how do you survive? How do you thrive? A lot of them end up becoming entrepreneurs, because really, that's actually the only real route, right? You could probably you can't even get an Uber job sometimes if you're a felon, right? So like your only way out is to either go back into crime or to reinvent yourself and start a business, right? And so I really applaud those people. But sometimes, and I've spoken with a FBI behavior analyst, like a profiler,
Interesting.
who in the case of LaDonna, she says people like LaDonna Humphrey, and she told me this was chilling. She goes, they cannot be rehabilitated. So there are the people that can be, because they either made a mistake in their lives and they learn from it, or there are some people that this is who they are, you know?
Right. Right. I guess it depends if you feel like what you're doing is wrong. And if it's not wrong to you, then why would you change it? It seems to work for you in the past. And I think also with some people who do this, and they do this really well, getting arrested helps them fine-tune their skills. They now know what to avoid doing and how to do it differently so that they can evade the law better, which is also chilling, because you want the whole point of being arrested to be that someone says, oh, yeah, no, that was wrong.
Yeah. I have you remind me of the story that I'm releasing soon called Operation Cockblock. And it's about these women who have been scammed by the same guy over and over and over again. And they all kind of banded together to try to prevent the next woman from becoming a target. And so you got this guy who's been convicted of a Ponzi scheme, multiple fraud cases. And they know this going in, and yet they still get suckered into buying him cars or motorcycles or putting their name on loans. And so despite knowing his criminal record, but he has convinced them somehow that he's changed, that he's a new man. And it's just crazy. But, eventually these women did smarten up, and they got together and have made it their life mission to take this guy down.
That's really good. It's reminding me of a movie from a long time ago called The First Wives Club.
Yes. Oh my God. That is just like that. I didn't even make that connection.
It's so funny. That is fantastic.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
I love that. I love that idea of coming together once you the light bulb goes off and you realize you have this in common with a lot of other people. But it's really good, I think, like you're saying, to just sort of kind of like giving people second chances, for people to give themselves that too, and realize this is just human nature, that we want to believe. We want to believe that someone's trustworthy. We want to believe that someone operates in the world the way we do. And sometimes it takes a lot of reminders that that's not the case, to really get the message.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. So tell us more. So teach us more about, the con artist. Do you know kind of what creates the con artist? What have you found? I mean, do they have something?
I always think I'm going to run out of story ideas. And I do have those freak out moments like, I just interviewed every con artist. But then there's always somebody, always people popping up. I think one of the most unique cons that I've reported on is there was a story that I covered called the Doula. And now when we think of cons, we think of financial cons, right? Well, we started the episode talking about religious, spiritual cons, right? But like there are some cons that don't involve money at all. Okay. And there was this woman out of Canada that was faking her pregnancy so she could, and hiring doulas. So she's paying for these doulas. She's, just to get the attention of these doulas, almost to the point where her water would break at some point, like when she was really just peeing on herself, she was not pregnant. And she would get all the way to the point of labor. And, one of the doulas was literally driving her to the hospital, and she would refuse to get out of the car, obviously, because she's not pregnant. And she finally convinced her, get out, get out. And so they walk through the emergency room doors. They go in, they put her in a wheelchair, and this woman maintained the lie all the way up to she gets put in one of the rooms, and they start doing an ultrasound right before the delivery, and they're looking, and it's an empty womb. And that's when the doula figured out, oh my God, I spent sleepless nights with this woman for the last couple days going through this intense labor, and contractions, and it was all a lie.
Yeah. Wow. That's incredible. That's incredible, I think, for this woman to need something so much.
Yeah.
That she was willing to go through all of that, or even probably I'm thinking with labor too, or contractions. You usually have to time them. So she needed to keep track every however
and
many
to
minutes.
fool a doula.
Yeah.
Who does this all the time. Right. And it wasn't just one doula. Eventually all the doulas in that area figured out, oh, wait a minute. We've all been in contact and have helped Caitlin Braun. Sometimes she would have a miscarriage, so it didn't go all the way to the labor, but it was all about maintaining that control over these doulas, right? Yeah.
Right. Maintaining control, getting something that you need. I mean, I just wonder what she didn't get or what she felt.
It was attention.
Yeah.
And that's another thing where you interviewed Andrea Dunlop, and she talks about Munchausen by proxy.
Yeah.
I did a story that I actually had Andrea, I interviewed her for the story, but this is a wild story. So this middle-aged couple from Arizona reaches out to me, and they tell me that they are the victims of a stalker. And they think that the stalker is their doctor's husband. Okay. So the doctor's husband is a stalker. Okay. I know that's hard. And at first it started very cordial, and then it turned into harassment, and then it turned into multiple accounts harassing them. And then they were getting pizzas delivered to their house. Then all of a sudden the cops would show up with guns in the middle of the night, swatting them. And it escalated and escalated. And I'm like, I want to help these people out. And I reported on the story for 2 years. And through pulling public records and all that, I started realizing that the messages, the IP addresses were coming from their own house. Someone in that house was the stalker. It wasn't the doctor's husband. It was either the husband, the wife, or the 3 adult kids. And it actually turned into this sort of Munchausen by proxy type situation, because the more I figured out about the story is that 2 of their adult children have no rights. The parents have rights over them. They took guardianship over them. They've had very extensive surgeries. One of them have had an unnecessary brain surgery. And spine surgeries and stomach surgeries and bladder surgeries. And you realize, wait a minute. So what do these things have in common? So there's a stalker, there's all this medical stuff that's happening, and the common denominator is attention, right? And they controlled me as they strung me along for years. They've been manipulating the law enforcement. They've been harassing this poor doctor and her husband, trying to ruin her career, calling CPS on them, calling the medical board. And it was just a big orchestrated campaign that they were creating to gain attention, I guess. I don't know. I don't know why people do what they do. It's so strange, Even after 8 years of doing this, things like that, even just telling you that story, it just why do people do that? I have no idea.
It's this insatiable need, and it's so self-driven. I mean, I would call it selfish if it were just selfish, but it clearly is a disorder.
Right.
Wow, it's reminding me of something that I dealt with a couple of years ago. It's so funny. I haven't thought about this in a while. I'm sure I blocked it out. I feel like now we're doing group therapy. Yeah, there was a woman who came to see me, and she said that she had a neurological disorder that caused her pain all over. And I feel for people who really have that, really have
right.
it. And she asked me if I had, like, what kind of seating I had in my office, and if I had a chair that had this kind of like this height of arms, because she couldn't bend her elbows past a certain degree, and she needed this kind of pillow, that kind of thing. And I got everything ready for her because she just said that she, had all of these issues. And back for her a pillow for her lower back, and that she gets low blood sugar, which is separate, but I said that's fine. I see, as you can see, I have like tea and coffee and whatever, and I can bring a snack, and so I'm like taking care of her, like I felt kind of almost maternal in the way that she was letting me know all that she needed. And she had also become a speaker at conferences for this particular disorder, and had raised a lot of money, and it was her cause celeb. And it turns out that none of it was real.
Oh.
And when I started talking to her, and I realized that the leg that she said she couldn't use very well suddenly changed. It's like, when you have an actor who's playing a certain role, and
And they get cut.
the director will say, no, it was your right arm that you
The
broke.
continuity.
Right? The continuity. Exactly. Right. Exactly. And I just started noticing those discrepancies. And then we just started talking about her history and how she has no friends, because I guess she just uses up those friendships, and they stop believing her. And she hasn't been able to sustain any love relationships, I think probably for the same reason. And as soon as I started questioning this, she sent in a complaint to my board to have me lose my license. And
You
she
see?
just went for it.
Yeah.
And
Because you called her out.
I called her out.
Yeah.
And it wasn't to say, aha, I got you. It was, let's look at this, because this is really destroying your life.
And even if you don't, even unintentional things that you question could be enough to provoke a response like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
It is crazy. Right. And so it's interesting what this other woman was saying about how there's no rehabilitation. And we want that to not be true, right? We want to know that.
I know.
It's almost hurts
people
to hear
could
that.
change.
Right. Exactly right. So,
and there are, I've never done this, and I'm meant to. I should revisit this now that you made me think about this, but there are groups out there of people who self-identify as sociopaths that say that they are functioning sociopaths because they are able to recognize and acknowledge their lack of empathies and all the things that come with being a sociopath, and they are able to, be out there with us. It's almost like, I envision it almost like a domesticated lion or something, like they have the ability to like just pounce and kill us all if they wanted to, but they're not, and so like that would be a very interesting, because I wonder, is there a way? Okay, so maybe they can't be rehabilitated, but are they able to coexist? That's interesting. I don't know. I don't ever want to count anybody out, but that is an interesting topic. I might pick that up.
Yeah, that is interesting. I think if you're able to call it for what it is and recognize you have that, it's like anyone who has something that's going to affect other people. You want them to recognize it. You want them to try to keep it in check. Like if someone has an anger management issue and they just, unleash on people,
right?
I guess for them to acknowledge that, and for them to not blame someone else for their angry outburst, and just know how to,
or to recognize it when it's happening.
Recognize it. Right. That's interesting. Yeah.
That isn't interesting. I'm not a psychologist, but it does fascinate me, And if somebody really has that much self-awareness, are they the kind of people that we're talking about anyway? Could they be a cult leader if you have this self-awareness. Could you be a con
Uh-huh.
artist? I don't know. Like sometimes I question, are you a sociopath, or do you just identify as a sociopath? But, because are sociopaths able to have this kind of empathy? I don't know. It's a really interesting conversation.
Wow. Right? Because maybe yes, and maybe this is part of the sociopathy, that they're drawing you in to have kind of a warm feeling towards them because you see them really working to understand
Right.
something about themselves. But
Yeah.
it's just more of the performance.
Well, and I've met people that are just naturally unempathetic, that
Mhm.
sometimes,
Mhm.
we all know these people, right? That are, that only want to talk about themselves. And if they never let you, they never ask you how you're doing or anything like
Mhm.
that. Or
Mhm.
if you get in a bad breakup, they're like, just get over it. And they don't take into account your feelings. So there are people that are not empathetic in society,
Mhm.
people that we
Mhm.
know. That doesn't make them a con artist, right?
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
doesn't make them a cult leader. It's
No.
like, I think when we classify people as con artists or cult leaders, it's kind of like a package deal, and that's just one of the traits, right?
Right. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
Yeah, there are many others that make you have you have to qualify. You have to
right.
qualify, and
Yeah,
there are a number of things that you have to have, or not have that, would kind of launch you into that stratosphere.
right.
Um, but I think, yeah, not having empathy, there are some people who have certain, just different neurological makeups that cause them to be less or more empathic at different times with
Hmm.
different people. They might also have empathy more towards animals than humans.
Right.
They also may have been abused themselves, so they've learned not to feel. There are a lot of things that
Right.
can happen, but right, I think it's interesting, just as we're kind of getting close to the end of our time talking, is there another story that you wanted to make sure to tell, or just another impression that you had about the work that you're doing and what you've learned, maybe even what you've learned about human nature?
Yeah. So what I've learned, I think through the process of doing this podcast, I've become a little bit more jaded in life. I
Okay.
think what I've learned and what I hope that my audience learns, because it's like my podcast is just a case study, so that you could listen to all these type of different stories and then kind of learn from it, and see what the
Mhm,
commonalities
mhm,
are. I tend to be more private. I tend to question people a lot more than I used to because I'm a half glass full kind of guy. But
mhm,
this podcast has made me kind of rethink some things,
mhm.
knowing that if you think that you won't fall for a con or a cult, you're wrong. You're probably a prime
Yeah,
target because your
yeah,
defenses are low. But also to be like aware of your surroundings and aware, and we talked about the line that we defined for
yeah.
ourselves, and be observant, when you're talking
Mhm,
with somebody. If you're on a date with somebody and you look at their left hand and they have an indentation where the ring should be,
mhm,
those are signs, right? So be observant.
mhm.
Also, they tell you some sort of fantastical story, something that it just seems too good to be true.
Yeah,
Ask them a detail, like, what was the weather like that day? What car were you driving? What color, was this? Any little detail to throw them off a little bit, because remember, these people are skilled liars. They're way better liars than you are and than you'll ever be, and they could run circles around you. But the
yeah.
more you could be observant and slow them down a little bit, it could avoid years of heartache, right?
Mhm, mhm. Oh, that's such good advice. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
It's good to know with all the stories that you covered, I'm sure it's good to know that you have these little gems now that you can go, "Here, this is what I've learned. This is what's gonna help hopefully keep you safer,"
Right.
which is a really lovely thing. So thank you. Thank you, Javier, for being with us today and for all the work that you do. If you ever wanna talk again, let me know.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. This was awesome. Great conversation
Yeah.
about con artists and cults, because they do go hand in hand.
They
So,
do. They really, really do. And if people don't understand really what a cult is and what a cult leader is like, it's nice for them to have this to go to where they can say, oh, con artist. Aha,
yeah,
I got it.
it's just a sub like division of con artists.
Oh, that makes it so much more understandable. Right. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.